Today's video is going to be packed with the wildest stories from the sporting world. We've got infamous cheaters, scandals that dominated headlines, and some dark history for you. So grab a snack, settle in and enjoy. And don't forget to like and subscribe.
Every 4 years, the world comes together to witness the amazing disabled elite athletes at the Paralympics. It's an event that celebrates the strength of the human spirit and brings out the best in sportsmanship. But behind the inspiring stories of perseverance and triumph lies a darker side of the Paralympics that is not often talked about. The Paralympics is now the third largest sporting event in the world, and millions of dollars worth of prize money and sponsorships are at stake. As we know, some people will do anything for fame and fortune. The 2000 Summer Paralympics in Sydney was already controversial due to numerous athletes returning positive drug tests. But the Spanish basketball team's shocking cheating scheme would tarnish the integrity of parasports forever. Fernando Martín Vicente, a man who seemingly dedicated his life to advocating for intellectually disabled athletes in Spain. His daughter was diagnosed with an intellectual disability when she was just a baby, which sparked his passion for the cause. In 1975, he founded the National Association of Special Sports, an organization that reportedly received substantial amounts of state funding over the years. Vicente also served as president of the Spanish Federation of Sports People with Intellectual Disabilities, or FEDI, vice president of the Spanish Paralympic Committee, and was also a member of the International Paralympic Committee, or IPC. His goal was to secure government grants and sponsorships from multinational corporations such as Telefonica and BBVA to improve sporting competitions for athletes with intellectual disabilities. Spanish newspaper El Mundo reported that his role within various organizations involved in sports and disabilities had earned him a €5 million fortune, as well as 8 cars, 5 houses, and a yacht. Despite the controversies surrounding his wealth, Vicente was instrumental in getting events for intellectually disabled athletes introduced at the 1996 Atlanta Games. To be classified as intellectually disabled, one had to score under 75 on an IQ test. FEDI was responsible for running the tests and assessing Spanish athletes. In 1998, Vicente approached semi-professional, non-disabled basketball players with an enticing offer: a free trip to Australia representing Spain and the chance to win €150,000. The catch? They would have to fake an intellectual disability and compete at the Paralympics. They did not have to sit IQ tests and were told that teams from other countries would employ the same tactic, so there was nothing to feel guilty about. Fake medical records were also forged for them. In the end, the Spanish intellectual disability basketball team was composed of 10 non-disabled players, as well as 2 players who did have genuine disabilities, including the team captain, Ramon Torres, who had no knowledge of the scheme. Ramon had actually tried to express that he felt something was not quite right about his teammates, but his concerns were ignored. The team trained for 5 months in Madrid and won competitions in Brazil and Portugal, which helped secure government funding. They arrived in Sydney, Australia in October 2000, ready to begin their Paralympic campaign. From the very first game, they dominated the other teams. In fact, their coach even told them to, quote, "Move down a gear or they'll figure out you're not disabled." Spain eventually breezed through the final and defeated Russia 87-63. They celebrated on the court and were all photographed proudly displaying their gold medals. However, their celebration was short-lived, as readers recognized the team members in photos published online and pointed out that they were not disabled. The team was instructed to disguise themselves by growing out their facial hair and wearing hats and sunglasses at the airport, but it was too late. A scandal was brewing, and the shocking truth would soon be revealed. When journalist and semi-professional basketballer Carlos Ribagorda was approached to join the Spanish intellectual disability basketball team, he saw an opportunity for a journalistic scoop. Despite not being intellectually disabled, Carlos decided to go along with the scheme to uncover the truth behind it. Soon after the Paralympics, he published an article in Capital magazine detailing the 2 years he spent pretending to be disabled without ever undergoing an intelligence test. In fact, the only test he ever had to perform was 6 push-ups. Carlos also alleged that Spain had recruited 15 non-disabled competitors in table tennis, athletics, and swimming, leading to the fraudulent win of 5 other medals. Carlos also stated that the Russian team they had to play in the final was suspiciously good, suggesting that Spain may not have been the only ones cheating. 2 months after the elaborate fraud was exposed, the team was forced to return their medals and the spending money they received. Sadly, the 2 men on the team who did have genuine disabilities also lost their medals. The IPC discovered that the Russian team, the other finalists, had not performed the required IQ tests either, so nobody ended up being awarded the gold medal. Fernando Martín Vicente, the president of FEDI, resigned from his position and accepted responsibility for the cheating, but he claimed that it was due to errors made during the complicated classification process. In 2013, he was found guilty of fraud and was fined €5,400 and ordered to return over €140,000 that FEDI had received from the government. Vicente denied having any knowledge or involvement in the cheating scheme. Charges were dropped against 18 others, including 10 fake Paralympians and other FEDI managers. Nearly 20 years after the scandal, Ramon Torres broke his silence and spoke out about how much emotional pain he still felt after being robbed of his gold medal. You think that life is one way, and then you discover that there are people who just want to fill their pockets and hurt others, he said. I'm still waiting for someone to call me and say they're sorry. The scandal sent shockwaves through not only the parasport community, but the wider sports world. Suddenly, the image of clean, inspirational, heroic Paralympics was shattered. The IPC conducted further investigations and concluded that many other countries had misrepresented their competitors' disabilities. As a result, the IPC removed all events for athletes with intellectual disabilities from the Paralympics until there was a more effective method of classifying them. Thousands of athletes from around the world had their dreams crushed as they were effectively banned from competing in Athens in 2004 and Beijing in 2008. In 2009, a new classification process was developed, and competitors with intellectual disabilities were finally allowed to compete in athletics, swimming, rowing, and table tennis in London 2012. The Paralympics has grown into major business since the Sydney Games in 2000, with countries and sponsors investing millions of dollars to fund and promote athletes whose stories highlight the best of humanity. At the Tokyo Games, Team USA Paralympians earn the same amount of prize money as Olympians for the first time. However, recent investigations by the BBC and Australian ABC have revealed a classification crisis in the Paralympics, which has led to widespread cheating. Since no 2 disabilities are alike, teams of classifiers for the International Paralympic Committee, the IPC, assess how athletes' impairments affect their performance and place them in classes with other competitors of similar skill, fitness, power, endurance, and other factors. Classification is a crucial component in ensuring the fairness and integrity of parasports. The idea is to create as level of a playing field as possible for every competitor. Athletes are expected to put in maximum effort when they are assessed so they can be accurately classified. However, the Paralympic classification system is flawed and can be easily exploited. Athletes have been intentionally underperforming or exaggerating their impairments to get classified with people who have more significant impairments, giving them an advantage in competition. This practice is known as intentional misrepresentation. According to the Australian Current Affairs program, Four Corners, Paralympic classifiers have been told to turn a blind eye by various national and international sporting bodies, and some have received threats of abuse from athletes and coaches. The sporting bodies are simply more concerned about winning medals than putting on a fair competition. The internal IPC report discovered recently by Four Corners stated that 69% of medals at the 2000 Paralympic Games were awarded to athletes who did not meet the proper requirements. Several former Paralympians and other insiders have claimed that for years, it has been an open secret that athletes intentionally misrepresent their disabilities during classification assessments. Former Australian para swimmer Ashley Cockburn whistleblew in 2019. She wrote in news.com.au that it was, quote, not only accepted, but it was expected for the Australian swim team to intentionally misrepresent their disabilities. She alleged that some coaches even trained their athletes on how to move in a way that mimics the symptoms of cerebral palsy. American swimmer and 29-time Paralympic medalist Jessica Long expressed similar concerns in 2020 to Sports Illustrated. She had been noticing that other competitors in her class had become increasingly more able-bodied, and she knew that cheating was particularly prevalent in para-swimming. Some swimmers with cerebral palsy would keep themselves cold and even throw themselves onto snow to make their muscles and joints stiffer. Some swimmers would keep their arms strapped up for days, only taking the tape off right before classification, so they are unable to fully stretch out their arm. Athletes have turned up to classification in wheelchairs they don't normally use and with limps they don't normally have. Athletes with injuries would get classified early in their recovery, knowing their function would vastly improve over time. There was even a case where an amputee swimmer had more of their limb removed in order to move down a class. The practice of poaching athletes from able-bodied competitors is also very common. Talent scouts could spot even the slightest uneven walk, for example, then approach the athlete and inform them that they could be eligible and classifiable for the Paralympics. In 2016, the IPC investigated more than 80 athletes for intentional misrepresentation, but there was not enough evidence to prove any wrongdoing. Australian Paralympian Amanda Reid, formerly known as Amanda Fowler, was one of the athletes who came under scrutiny as she had switched sports and classifications several times in her career. Amanda had won non-disabled speed skating competitions as a child before competing at the London Paralympics in 2012 as an intellectually disabled swimmer, where she finished 5th. According to Simon Watkins, her swimming coach, Amanda's mother had asked if she could change her classification to a physical disability. The coach replied that it was not possible, as Amanda didn't have a physical disability. A few years later, she was seen using a white walking stick and competing in athletics as a visually impaired runner. Coaching staff and teammates were puzzled as they had previously seen her driving a car. However, impairments can be degenerative, so it was not questioned. At the 2016 Rio Paralympics, Amanda had changed her surname and competed as a cyclist in a classification for physically disabled athletes with cerebral palsy. Her former swimming teammates were surprised by this classification, because Amanda never once mentioned to them that she had cerebral palsy. She won a silver medal that year and went on to win gold in Tokyo in 2021. Rebecca Chin was just 16 when she competed at the 2008 Beijing Paralympics as a member of Team Britain. Although she was born with the relatively minor impairment of hyperflexible ankles, Rebecca had always competed in non-disabled sports and did not consider herself disabled. However, doctors and coaches informed her that she had cerebral palsy and would be eligible for the Paralympics. Instructed by adult staff, Rebecca fatigued herself by working out in her hotel room right before her classification assessment, which caused her to underperform. She ended up getting placed in a cerebral palsy classification, much to the dismay and objection of other athletes in her class. She won a silver medal in the discus event, but after scrutiny from the IPC, she was later reclassified and had her medal stripped. The IPC's medical director and head of classification, Peter van der Vliet, told the BBC that he received emails every day with allegations of people faking impairment. However, he has no control over which athletes countries recruit and qualify. Other high-ranking IPC officials have similarly expressed their concerns and sense of powerlessness when it comes to cheating. Some Paralympians, such as British sprinter Bethany Woodward, have even handed back their medals, feeling that they were not won fairly because they knew their teammates were not disabled or had misrepresented their impairment. Other athletes chose to quit their sports entirely when the feeling of helplessness became overwhelming as they watched their rivals compete against and beat legitimately impaired athletes. They were breaking records and claiming taxpayer-funded grants, scholarships, and sponsorships without punishment. There is also the ugliness of genuine para-athletes being accused of cheating by their peers and even parents, and being forced to share medical records to prove their classification. Some coaches and officials believe classification cheating should carry the same penalties that are in place for doping. The problem is, it is much harder to prove that someone is misrepresenting their impairment. The former head of the IPC, Xavier Gonzalez, believes an independent third party should take over the task of classification from the IPC, the same way the independent World Anti-Doping Agency handles drug testing in the Olympics. The unfortunate truth is that underneath the inspirational feel-good vibes of the Paralympics is a flawed classification system that creates an incentive for athletes to underperform or exaggerate a disability. And there are still no repercussions for those who cheat. Athletes, coaches, and national Paralympic committees know they can just get away with it. The heart-pounding, unimaginably dangerous world of the Isle of Man TT, where only the most fearless and most skilled motorcyclists come to conquer the 37.7-mile mountain course. 40,000 spectators descend upon the small island every year to watch these riders reach average speeds of over 130 miles per hour and top speeds of over 200 miles per hour. As exhilarating as the event is, in its 116-year history, it has claimed the lives of over 260 riders, officials, and spectators. Yet, there is absolutely no sign of the Isle of Man TT slowing down anytime soon. In 1903, the UK introduced the Motor Car Act and placed a modest speed restriction of 20 miles per hour on automobiles. Early motorheads were already passionate about testing the capabilities of their vehicles, so Sir Julian Ord, the Secretary of the Automobile Club of Great Britain and Ireland, set off for the Isle of Man to seek permission to race on the roads there. The Isle of Man is a small island located in the middle of the Northern Irish Sea. It is a self-governing British Crown dependency with a current population of 84,000 people and is known for its rugged, sprawling landscape. In 1904, Sir Julian Ord was granted permission to create the 52-mile high roads course in the Isle of Man as a part of the Gordon Bennett Car Trial, one of the earliest car racing championships. Clifford Earl won, completing the 5 laps covering 225 miles in 7 hours and 26 minutes. He won again the following year, but shaved his time down to 6 hours and 6 minutes for 6 laps of the course. A motorcycle race was introduced that year to satiate the fans' thirst for more speed, but the primitive bikes couldn't even make it up the steep climbs of the mountain section. J.S. Campbell completed an altered 125-mile course and won in 4 hours and 9 minutes, even after his motorcycle caught fire during a pit stop. His average race speed was about 30 miles per hour. The motorcycle event was a huge hit, so on the 28th of May 1907, the stage was set for the inaugural Isle of Man Tourist Trophy race. It was organised by the Autocycle Club and spanned 10 laps of the 15-mile St. John's short course. Regulations for saddles, pedals, mudguards, and exhaust silencers were introduced for the first time. Year after year, the event grew in popularity. Automotive technology was also advancing rapidly during this time, so the motorcycles just kept getting faster. In 1911, the Isle of Man TT moved to the Snaefell Mountain course, a course that remains largely unchanged to this day. Riders had to navigate a lap of 37.7 miles, which included hundreds of turns and tight corners, and reached an elevation of 1,300 feet. In the early days, the roads were also little more than rough horse and cart tracks, and even had gates between fields, which had to be opened and closed by the racers. The program became more formalized and expanded to 2 individual races, the Junior TT and the main event, Senior TT. In the 1920s, basic safety measures like helmets were introduced, road conditions improved, and the lap speeds reached 55 miles per hour. In 1923, a sidecar TT was launched, a spectacle that remains a highlight of the event to this day. It involves a rider who operates the vehicle while a passenger crouches in a sidecar platform, completely unsecured except for 2 hand grips, who then has to lean their body to serve as a counterweight. The Manx Grand Prix was established in the same year as an amateur alternative to the Isle of Man TT. The Manx GP is also held on the mountain course and caters for up-and-comers and those who have no previous experience on the course, serving as a stepping stone for those who want to eventually compete in the Isle of Man TT. Races were cancelled during World War I and II, but in 1938, a new speed record of 91 miles per hour was set by Harold Daniel. However, following World War II, the speeds actually decreased due to poor petrol quality. The Isle of Man Senior TT race became part of the Motorcycle World Championship, now known as MotoGP, in 1949, and saw the world's top riders and manufacturers raise the bar even further. Many fans considered the 50s and 60s to be the golden era of the TT, as the competition was fiercer and more entertaining than ever. In 1957, Bob McIntyre became the first rider ever to achieve an average speed of 100 miles per hour for one lap of the mountain course, beating many other stars who were all fighting for the breakthrough. In 1971, legendary British rider Barry Sheene refused to enter another TT and campaigned to have the race stripped of its championship status. "Why bother? It's so much easier to just shoot yourself and get it over with," he said. In 1976, the Isle of Man TT was removed from the World Championships due to its rising death toll. But the late 70s brought a new era of the now independent TT. In 1977, King of the Mountain, Joey Dunlop, would earn his first win of an astounding 26, while Dick Greasley and Mick Skeels became the first sidecar duo to hit 100 miles per hour. Speed records continued getting smashed throughout the 80s and 90s, and legendary rivalries emerged. These days, competitors are reaching top speeds of over 200 miles per hour, and the TT has become more action-packed and popular than ever. However, since 1937, there has only been 1 year of the races in which nobody has died. Unlike the tracks used in MotoGP, which are all purpose-built and maintained for motorcycle racing, the roads in the TT can sometimes be rough, uneven, and consist of different surface types. Riders have to adapt to various road conditions while also having to factor in the buildings, curbs, centuries-old stone walls, lampposts, and trees that line the course. The mountain course is also much longer than the average motorcycle race course, and has over 200 turns that riders have to memorize and execute very precisely. If a rider anticipates a corner incorrectly or miscalculates their path even slightly, it could result in a fatal crash. Some experienced riders say it can take 3 years to properly memorize all the turns. The very beginning of the course, the starting line, ironically overlooks the island's Douglas Burrows Cemetery, serving as an ominous warning to those who dare take on the mountain course. In 1911, 19-year-old Victor Sturridge crashed and died while overtaking during a practice run of the new mountain course, marking the first fatality of the TT. Since then, 266 others have lost their lives, including competitors of the Isle of Man TT and Manx Grand Prix, race officials, spectators, and members of the public giving the course a go between races. It is simply an accepted part of the competition that at least one person who starts the race will die before reaching the finish line. 1970 was one of the TT's deadliest years, with 6 fatalities, followed by a string of high-profile deaths in the next few years, which attracted significant criticism and ultimately caused the TT to lose its world championship status. In 1986, Jean McDonnell died on the notorious Balla Bridge, in what many consider to be the TT's most horrific accident. A helicopter had been dispatched to rescue another fallen rider, which spooked a horse and sent it dashing onto the road, just as McDonnell was flying across the bridge at full speed. Both McDonnell and the horse died instantly, while the motorcycle crashed into a row of parked cars and exploded. In 2003, Dave Jeffries, a highly experienced 9-time winner of the TT, spun out on an oil slick and collided with a stone wall. His bike skidded down the road, hitting a telephone pole, bringing down wires that entangled another racer, Jim Moody. Jeffries died on impact, but Moody survived. The previous year, Jeffries had told a journalist, "You have to be totally at ease with yourself, know exactly what you were doing, and accept that you might be going home in a box." In 2005, Joachim Carlsen crashed during a practice race and died in the front garden of Marjorie and Ian Forrest. Medics attended to him, but his body was left on the Forrest family's front garden for 90 minutes as they had to wait for the practice race to finish, then for the helicopter to finish rescuing another rider. That year was also one of the deadliest. A total of 3 riders and 1 marshal died during the Isle of Man TT, while 6 riders and a bystander died during the Manx GP. In 2007, Mark Ramsbotham clipped a pole, killing him instantly and launching his 400-pound bike at a crowd of onlookers. 2 spectators were killed and many were hit by flying debris. 2 race marshals were also badly injured, including Hilary Musson, whose leg had to be amputated as a result of her injuries. In 2018, Dan Neen crashed and died at the scene during the Superbike TT qualifying practice session. Red flags were waved, indicating to other riders to stop. Marshals instructed riders to proceed back to the paddock area in the opposite direction of the race. As Steve Mercer rode back, he collided head-on with a course car that was headed towards the scene of the fatality. Mercer was critically injured but fortunately survived, and a new red flag procedure was implemented. Another reason why the TT attracts 30 to 40,000 visitors every year is Mad Sunday, the Sunday that falls between practice week and competition week. Over 10,000 motorcycle enthusiasts bring their bikes via ferry to take advantage of the lack of speed limits and have a go at the infamous course. The professionals stay clear as traffic is directed one way and the general public riders get a taste of the TT, all while sharing the road with local motorists. Although the majority of visitors are respectful of the roads and the island, dozens of alcohol-related arrests are made every year, and amateur thrill seekers who overestimate their abilities, unsurprisingly, cause many accidents and even deaths. Numerous new safety measures get added to the TT almost every year, like improved road surfacing, widening of the roads, banning wet riding, higher marshalling standards, and placing of protective equipment around the course. In 2003, Northern Irish trauma doctor John Hines pioneered the deployment of doctors on purpose-built superbikes a few seconds after the riders, so they could provide much faster medical responses than ambulances and helicopters. Sadly, Dr. Hines died while providing medical care during a motorcycle race in Ireland. 2022 saw the most significant changes and innovations in safety. Every inch of the TT course was carefully assessed for risks and a new F1-style digital red flag system was installed. A bespoke GPS tracking system became mandatory and CCTV was installed throughout the course. Other changes to race management, rider equipment, accident response, marshalling, and paddock infrastructure were also introduced, and were designed in a way that they wouldn't be too noticeable to spectators. Despite the organizers' best efforts, 2022's death toll equaled the highest record of 6 and included a father-son sidecar team, Roger and Bradley Stockton. And a few months ago, in June 2023, the mountain course claimed the life of Raul Torres Martinez during the Super Twin TT race. So why has this unbelievably dangerous event been allowed to run for so many years? The TT has naturally drawn plenty of criticism over the years, but it's unlikely it will get shut down anytime soon. Firstly, the TT and Manx GP are sanctioned by the Isle of Man government, and the races are actually integral in supporting the local economy. In 2019, the TT alone generated about £32 million and over 800 jobs to the Manx economy, as tens of thousands flocked to the island to watch the racing. All races were cancelled in 2020 and 2021 due to COVID, and according to a BBC report, cost the Isle of Man Treasury £246 million. But the main reason why the TT won't get banned and probably shouldn't be banned is the searing passion of the riders and fans. The Isle of Man TT is considered to be the pinnacle of motorcycle racing, the most challenging and unforgiving test that riders can put themselves through. For fans, it's getting to witness some of the fastest men and women on earth barrel past, be able to hear and feel the roar of the powerful machines at an incredibly close proximity. Since the TT was stripped of its world championship status in 1976, every competitor who enters does so willingly and not under any obligation to collect points or fulfill contracts. Every racer is 100% aware of the risks, and for them, the fun, the adrenaline, the glory is worth it. A rich culture and tradition has also formed around the TT that runs very deeply among the community, so it can be hard for those of us on the outside to understand. King of the Mountain Joey Dunlop died in 2000 at a little-known race in Estonia after losing control of his bike on the wet road. Robert Dunlop, Joey's brother and Michael's father, had competed 18 times at the TT and died after crashing during a practice session at the 2008 Northwest 200 race in the UK. His sons Michael and William were riding on the same circuit not far behind their father. They were the first ones that came across his body on the road. 2 days after Robert's death, Michael and William shocked the crowds as they appeared to compete even after the officials had decided not to permit either of them to race. Michael went on to win and dedicated the victory to his father. 10 years later, Michael's brother William crashed and died while competing in Dublin. Michael Dunlop, now 34, has 25 TT wins under his belt, just one win shy of his uncle Joey's record. The trauma of losing his father, brother, and uncle to motorcycle racing hasn't deterred him at all. In fact, it seems to fuel him to carry on the family legacy. Christine Cowley's father competed in the sidecar TT as a passenger, and her brother Paul followed in his footsteps. In 2004, 22-year-old Paul lost his grip during a practice lap and fell out of the moving vehicle and died. But in an interview with Canada's CBC radio, Christine said she still watches and enjoys the TT every year because the racers are all doing what they love. Conor Cummins' horrific 2010 crash in the senior TT has been viewed millions of times on YouTube. He can be seen getting violently thrown off his bike before his body bounces and flails down the steep hill. He shattered 5 vertebrae, bruised his lungs, fractured his pelvis, dislocated his knee, and broke his arm. His friend Guy Martin also suffered a heavy crash in the same race, smashing into a stone wall at close to 200 miles per hour, causing a massive explosion and many broken bones. Both men cheated death that year and were both back on their bikes a year later. There isn't much of a financial incentive for the competitors either. Prize money is distributed among 1st to 20th place holders, but the first place prize for the senior TT and superbike TT races is just £18,000, while winners of the other races get half that amount. Sponsorships do help ease the cost of competing, but most TT racers have regular jobs for the majority of the year. TT stars like Cameron Donald works as a plumber, Guy Martin is a truck mechanic, and even Michael Dunlop has a construction business. It might be easy to dismiss these riders as crazy, but as the 9-time TT winner and current senior TT record holder Peter Hickman puts it, it's very much the opposite. You've really got to use your brain, referring to how much focus is required to survive the mountain. He then added, "Life is short as it is. I would rather go away doing something like this."
8 months completely alone at sea. It is 1969 and communication with home is limited. It is just you and your mind, thinking about all the mistakes you've made in your life that have led you to this point. This is where 36-year-old Donald Crowhurst found himself. He now had to make a critical decision. In May 1967, Francis Chichester became the first person to sail around the world solo. He made one stop in Sydney and after 9 months alone on the open seas, returned home to England and was greeted by 250,000 well-wishers. He was a national hero and was knighted soon after. The following year, the British Sunday Times newspaper decided to sponsor the first non-stop solo round-the-world yacht race. It was an open race with no qualifying requirements, as long as competitors started between June 1st and October 31st to ensure they passed through the Southern Ocean during summer. The first person to complete the feat would be awarded with the Golden Globe Trophy, and whoever recorded the fastest time would win £5,000, equivalent to roughly £70,000 today.
9 men entered the race. All were highly experienced and esteemed yachtsmen and sailors, except for one man, Donald Crowhurst. Donald Crowhurst was a business owner and amateur sailor from Bridgewater in Somerset, England. Growing up, his family was very poor, and Donald had to leave school early when his father died. Donald worked in the Air Force in the 1950s as a pilot and as an engineer. He married his wife Claire in 1957, and together they had 4 children. In Bridgewater, Donald started his own electronics company, Electron Utilization, and manufactured navigational equipment. Business was slow. Donald made just enough money to feed his family and keep a roof over their heads. He always had a yearning for adventure, and begun to feel like he hadn't used his skills and abilities to achieve his full potential. When Donald heard about the Golden Globe race around the world, he felt compelled to enter. If he could build a boat using his own electronics and inventions, then complete the race or even win, it would generate a huge amount of publicity. He would become a national hero like Francis Chichester. He believed this was his chance to completely turn his life around. While other competitors already had boats that just needed some modifications, Donald needed to build one from scratch. He came up with a modified trimaran design that would be equipped with advanced electronics that would make it faster and safer. The only thing missing was money. Donald mortgaged his house, then secured 2 sponsors: the town of Tidmouth in Devon and local businessman Stanley Best, an investor of Donald's company, Electron Utilization. The vessel was named Tidmouth Electron after its 2 sponsors. Donald could finally get to work on his boat and was optimistic about his adventure. However, his money issues were just the first of many, many problems that would arise. Donald was convinced that the trimaran model with the hulls on either side of the main hull would be ideal for speed as well as safety. He believed it was the best option to get him across the choppy waters of the Southern Ocean. He planned to install additional safety measures he designed himself, as well as a revolutionary computer that would sense when the boat was tipping and trigger a flotation device. The Tidmouth Electron was designed with very few non-essentials, so it would be lightweight and therefore travel faster. The living quarters were considerably smaller than those of Donald's fellow competitors. He also only brought 5 books for what could be up to 8 or 9 months at sea. With the October 31st deadline looming closer and budget running out, Donald had to rush to complete the boat. He was forced to cut corners. He had to forego his computer and made some less than ideal substitutions on various parts of the boat. On top of everything, Stanley Best, one of the sponsors, made Donald sign an agreement. If Donald dropped out of the race before it began, or if he dropped out early on, he would have to pay back the cost of the Tidmouth Electron, which would completely bankrupt him. Everything was on the line. He had no choice but to successfully complete the round-the-world race. On September 23rd, Donald sailed the Tidmouth Electron on its maiden voyage to its namesake and sponsor town. Donald's publicity officer believed officially starting the race from Tidmouth would attract visitors and press and boost the image and economy of the town. The voyage to Tidmouth was supposed to take 3 days, but ended up taking 2 weeks. Donald's wife Claire was tasked with christening the boat by releasing a champagne bottle tied to a ribbon, but the bottle didn't smash and instead bounced off the hull, which is considered bad luck. One of the boat's builders quickly grabbed the bottle and smashed it by hand. The boat was damaged on its maiden voyage, and it was also discovered that it could not perform windward. In other words, it could not travel against the wind, but there was no time for repairs. The other competitors had already begun their journeys. In fact, 2 men had already dropped out of the race when they reached the Southern Ocean. There was no chance Donald could win the Golden Globe trophy for first man home, but there was still the £5,000 cash prize for the fastest time. In the days leading up to the deadline, it was total chaos. Donald and the boat builders were scrambling to get everything done, but they were dangerously behind schedule. Donald was also proving to be a clumsy sailor and was imprecise with navigation. He simply wasn't ready. It was a terrible predicament. Either he drops out of the race, goes bankrupt, and plunges his family into poverty, or he takes the unfinished boat out to sea to face near certain death. The night before the deadline, Donald confessed to his sponsor, Stanley Best, about the issues, but Stanley reminded him of the agreement, and the next day, Donald got ready to start the race. On the 31st of October 1968, crowds gathered in Teignmouth to watch 36-year-old Donald Crowhurst begin his solo voyage around the world. Donald farewelled his wife Claire and his 4 children and took off. However, immediately there was an issue with the sails and the boat had to be towed back for repairs. Finally, at the very last moment before the race deadline, Donald departed on the Teignmouth Electron, and before long, he was just a tiny speck on the horizon. Modern sea vessels have GPS and internet access and are able to maintain communication lines at all times. In the 1960s, the only way for boats out at sea to communicate with land was via radio calls and telegrams. There were no satellites that could pinpoint your exact location. You couldn't text or FaceTime anyone. You were truly and utterly alone in the vast and unforgiving expanse of the ocean. Donald had a long journey ahead of him. First down to the South Atlantic, past the Cape of Good Hope, where he would then hit the Roaring Forties. The lack of large land masses in the Southern Ocean causes extremely strong westerly winds, creating endless storms that circle the planet, producing waves of up to 10 meters or 33 feet high. Thousands and thousands of miles later, he would pass the south of Australia and New Zealand, and sail across the Pacific to Cape Horn, where the seas are very violent. Finally, he would sail north past the equator, back into the Atlantic and home to Britain. That was the plan anyway. Donald struggled with his boat for the first few weeks of his voyage. It was unfinished, damaged and leaking, and any fixes he could make would certainly not survive the turbulent southern seas. The BBC provided him with a camera and tape recorder, and Donald did a good job of appearing like everything was going well, but his logbook told a different story. He wrote about how he believed his chances of survival were, quote, 50-50, and that soon he would have to make, quote, a bloody awful decision. Meanwhile, 3 more men had dropped out of the race due to illness and dangerous conditions. Robin Knox Johnston was in the lead. For over a month, Donald made slow progress in the race while he agonized over what to do. Continue the race in a boat that was falling apart and drown? Give up, drop out of the race and face financial ruin? Or he could lie about his positions, hang tight in the South Atlantic for a few months, and then sail home to Britain. The competitors were required to report their positions regularly via radio or telegram. From December 6th, Donald began reporting vague and sometimes cryptic false positions and never specified coordinates. He claimed to be much further ahead than where he actually was. Those back home were now getting excited that Donald was making record time and catching up with the other competitors. Newspapers were comparing Donald to Francis Chichester. In mid-December, Donald reported he was advancing rapidly towards the Southern Ocean. He logged his false positions and planned to come in 3rd or 4th in the race to avoid close scrutiny of his logbooks. He planned out all his fake positions, then started a secret logbook with his real positions. At the time, he filmed and recorded himself playing the part of the positive, competent sailor. On Christmas Eve 1968, Donald made a radio call to his wife Claire. He couldn't tell her about his plan, and Claire couldn't tell him about how she was worried sick. Both of them put on a happy, confident front for the press. He was asked to give a precise position, but refused, and stated that he was, quote, off Cape Town, which was much further than the fake position he had planned out earlier. In mid-January, Donald lied and reported he was having issues with his radio and had to shut it off. Due to the radio silence, newspapers began to exaggerate Donald's estimated position to create excitement. The man coming in 2nd place, Nigel Tetley, began to feel the pressure, believing that Donald was closing in on him. In reality, Donald was sailing aimlessly along the east coast of Brazil, waiting for others to pass him as they headed north back to Britain. On March 8, 1969, Donald desperately needed to make repairs on his boat and stopped at the tiny settlement of Rio Salado in Argentina, breaking the rules of the race. His arrival was logged by the Coast Guard, but he managed to get away without anyone realizing who he was. Donald then decided to head south to film and experience the Southern Ocean conditions to make his logs seem more legitimate. The more Donald fabricated his logs, the harder it became for him to officially drop out of the race, as he was nowhere near his reported positions. On April 22nd, Robin Knox Johnston completed his voyage and won the Golden Globe Trophy, becoming the first person to sail solo non-stop around the world. It took him 312 days. By now, Donald Crowhurst and Nigel Tetley were the only two people left in the race, and it was a head-to-head battle for the £5,000 cash prize. Nigel Tetley's boat was in very bad shape at this point, but he decided to push harder in order to win the fastest time. On May 20th, Nigel Tetley ran into a storm which caused his boat to start breaking apart. He abandoned ship and dropped out of the race. Suddenly, Donald found himself exactly where he didn't want to be. He was the last man standing, and his falsely reported high speeds guaranteed him the £5,000 prize. He wanted to avoid close examination of his logbooks, but now it was inevitable. He had calculated fake positions to write down in his logbook, but some of his speeds were unrealistic. Plus, he never actually experienced the Roaring Forties and had no idea how accurately he could describe the conditions. In mid-June, Donald and his publicity agent exchanged telegrams about television appearances, interviews, and how a fleet of boats and helicopters were waiting to welcome Donald home. Over the next several days, the Teignmouth Electron drifted in the mid-Atlantic untended, as its captain descended into a deeply disturbed state. It's hard to imagine how Donald must have been feeling at this stage. He had already endured 8 months of total solitude while also battling the harsh conditions of the open seas. He couldn't drop out of the race as he was far behind his reported positions and he would be exposed as a fraud. He couldn't keep going as his boat likely wouldn't survive, and if it did, he risked being exposed through his fabricated logbook. His reputation as a businessman and engineer would be destroyed and he'd face financial ruin. Desperate, lonely, lost, unable to find a solution, Donald began writing about philosophy and metaphysics. Over the next 8 days, he wrote a 25,000-word manifesto that revealed how tortured and disconnected from reality he became. His manifesto was rambling and incoherent at times. It contained ruminations about mathematical and religious philosophy, as well as mental arguments with himself and with Einstein about the purpose of life. He seemed to have concluded that human beings were all part of a game controlled by some higher beings. His mental state had deteriorated so much that he didn't even mention his 4 children in his writings. Towards the end, the writings became more and more unclear, but alludes to a revelation. Now is revealed the true nature and purpose and power of the game offense. I am what I am, and I see the nature of my offense. It is finished. It is finished. It is the mercy. Donald's last log entry was dated July 1st, 1969. The Teignmouth Electron was found abandoned by a cargo ship in the mid-Atlantic. It is presumed that Donald had jumped overboard. Only 3 of the 4 logbooks he carried were found, including one with his real positions. The truth was reported in the newspapers. Robin Knox Johnston was the only man who finished the Golden Globe race around the world. He donated the £5,000 cash prize to the Crowhurst family. Today, the remnants of the Teignmouth Electron lay abandoned on the Caribbean island of Cayman Brac. Donald Crowhurst's body was never found.
We thoroughly enjoy a cheating scandal here at AM Glimpse. We've covered the Spanish Paralympic basketball team who faked their disabilities to win gold, Rosie Ruiz who came in first in the Boston Marathon after she jumped on the subway and skipped most of the run, and Charles Ingram, the coughing major who won Who Wants to Be a Millionaire with a little help from the sidelines. There have been countless audacious individuals and teams across major sports and niche competitions who risked it all just to win. Doping, faking, fixing, tampering, spying, and hand-of-godding their way to glory and fortune. These stories will live on in infamy forever, but today we're going to get into some of the weirder and wackier cheating scandals that you may not have heard of. So if you live in Australia or any country where the sport cricket is a big deal, you actually would have heard about this. But it is a weird one. In Cape Town, March 2018, during Australia's test match against South Africa, the cameras caught Australian player Cameron Bancroft pulling something out of his pocket, holding it in his palm and rubbing it on the ball. Realizing he was being shown on the big screen, he panicked, then proceeded to hide a small yellow object down the front of his pants. But the cameras and umpires saw the whole thing. Head coach Darren Lehman looked on from his box in disbelief. Did one of his players really just try to ball tamper? In other words, cheat? When Cameron Bancroft was confronted by umpires, he tried to cover up what he had done by showing them that a black sunglasses pouch was the only thing in his pocket. The umpires didn't buy it. They knew he had rubbed the cricket ball with the yellow foreign object. He came clean with team captain Steve Smith standing beside him. It was actually a piece of sticky tape that had been torn off some padding equipment. He had stuck bits of sand and dirt from the ground to it. He then used it to scuff up one side of the ball, either to force a swing when the ball is bowled to confuse the batter, or to damage it enough to get a replacement ball brought in. Reports on what they were trying to achieve vary. But one thing was for certain, the Australian cricket team had just cheated and were caught red-handed. The umpires inspected the ball and decided it hadn't been altered enough to need replacing. Play continued, but a very dark cloud now hovered over the Aussies and they ended up losing the series. Cameron Bancroft was charged with ball tampering. In the press conference later that day, team captain Steve Smith admitted that the plan had been cooked up ahead of time by the leadership group, but the coaches and managers had zero involvement. Smith didn't seem to realize at the time just how big of a deal this would become. He said he just wanted to move on and expressed that he had no intention of stepping down as captain. That choice wasn't really up to him though. The scandal rocked Australia. Cricket fans felt betrayed and ashamed. Non-cricket fans embarrassed but a little amused. Plenty of cricket fans around the world believed this was not the first time Australia had cheated and that they were only sorry that they got caught. It is pretty crazy that the players thought they'd get away with sandpapering the ball on a field with over 100 cameras pointing at them, most of which had extreme slow-mo and zoom capabilities. Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull even publicly expressed his disappointment and asked Cricket Australia to investigate and take action. Cameron Bancroft was banned from playing cricket for 9 months. Captain Steve Smith and Vice Captain David Warner were both stripped of their roles and banned from cricket for 12 months. The investigation revealed that David Warner was the one who came up with the plan and enlisted the younger, more junior Cameron Bancroft to carry out the ball tampering. Just a few weeks before Sandpapergate, David Warner nearly got into a physical fight with a South African player who allegedly made inappropriate comments about his wife. Head coach Darren Lehman, who was cleared of any involvement or wrongdoing, resigned shortly after the incident. It's no secret that soccer players feign and exaggerate their falls and injuries in an effort to win their team penalties. But in September 1989, Chilean goalkeeper Roberto Rojas took it to a whole other level. It was a FIFA World Cup qualifier, and Chile was down against Brazil 0-1 in the second half. The last game between the rivals a month ago had been explosive. Players exchanged heated words and very rough tackles, resulting in 2 red cards and several more yellow, with a final score of 1-1. The pressure was now on for Chile to win this game in order to qualify for the 1990 World Cup. In the 68th minute of play, the game was suddenly stopped. A rogue flare had been thrown onto the pitch by one of the 140,000 spectators and appeared to have hit Chilean goalkeeper Roberto Rojas. The goalie was on the ground, writhing around in agony, surrounded by smoke, his face covered in blood. His teammates clamoured around him, gesturing for medical help before carrying him off the pitch. Almost all of the Chileans had walked off, and after a confusing 20 minutes, the referees had to end the game. There was no footage of the flare hitting Rojas. Photographers on the sidelines rushed back to their labs to develop their film to check if they had gotten a clear shot of the moment of impact. Luckily, photographer Riccardo Alfieri had captured 4 clear shots of the flare flying through the air, then landing a full meter away from Rojas. If he hadn't been hit by the flare, why was he bleeding so profusely that night? 2 days later, a medical report was released. It stated that Rojas did not have any burn marks, only a cut on the left side of his forehead. After a few days of questioning, Rojas confessed it was a self-inflicted cut. He used a razor blade that he had hidden in his goalie glove. The team doctor and one of the managers had cooked up the plan well ahead of time. Rojas was to cut himself and pretend he was badly injured so the game could be stopped and abandoned if things weren't going well. The Brazilian home crowd had been rowdy during the game, tossing bottles and fruit onto the pitch. So when a lit flare landed a meter away from him, Rojas saw this as an opportunity to make the Brazilians look bad and force a rematch or even a disqualification. He threw himself on the grass, rolled around in the smoke, sneakily took the razor blade out of his glove and cut his own forehead. After the truth came out, FIFA awarded Brazil a 2-0 win, while Chile was disqualified from the 1990 World Cup as well as the next one in 1994. Roberto Rojas was given a lifetime ban that was eventually lifted in 2001. Several others on the Chilean squad were given suspensions, including the coach Orlando Aravena, captain Fernando Estengo, team doctor Daniel Rodriguez, as well as president of the Football Federation of Chile, Sergio Stoppel. The Brazilian fan who threw the flare was a 24-year-old woman named Rosemary Mayo de Nascimento. She was arrested a few days after the game and fined $12,000, but went on to become a minor celebrity and even grace the cover of Brazilian Playboy magazine. In April 2009, English rugby player Tom Williams put on his own bloody display to force an advantage for his team. It was the quarter-final of the Heineken Cup, a European rugby union tournament. It was the English team Harlequins against the Irish team Leinster. The Harlequins were down 1 point with just 5 minutes left in the game. Harlequins head coach Dean Richards wanted to bring star goal kicker Nick Evans, who had gone off with an injury, back onto the field for one last goal attempt. The only way to sub an injured player back on was in the event of what's called a blood injury. The Harlequins physio, Steph Brennan, ran onto the pitch and handed 25-year-old winger Tom Williams a small capsule of fake blood. Go into contact, put this in your mouth, chew it, and go down. We'll get you off, Brennan instructed. So Williams did exactly that. He got himself tackled, knelt down, took the blood capsule out of his sock, popped it into his mouth, and bit down. With blood dripping out of his mouth, he feigned an injury, got the attention of the referees, and was allowed to be subbed off and replaced by Nick Evans. While walking off the pitch, Williams gave one of his teammates a wink to indicate that he was okay, a move that would get misconstrued and become infamous in the aftermath. The timing of it all was a little too convenient. Even the commentators remarked that Tom Williams must have punched himself. Plus, Nick Evans had been seen warming up just minutes before the blood appeared. Staff on the Leinster side were immediately suspicious and confronted Harlequins head coach Dean Richards. Evans was set up with a chance to score a last-minute goal, but he kicked the ball wide and the Harlequins lost. After the game ended, it was chaos. The Leinster squad were yelling that it was fake blood. Tom Williams and the team's matchday doctor, Wendy Chapman, had locked themselves in the change room in panic. Tournament officials were banging on the door, demanding to see Williams' supposed injury. Williams begged Dr. Chapman to cut his lip for real, threatening to do it himself if she didn't. The doctor had nothing to do with the blood capsule, but she didn't want to risk Williams causing himself serious harm, so she pulled out a scalpel and made a small incision in his lip. The months following Bloodgate were just as dramatic. Williams was initially suspended for 12 months and the club was fined £215,000. Head coach Dean Richards was banned for 3 years, physio Steph Brennan copped a 2-year ban, and Dr. Wendy Chapman was suspended for a year by the General Medical Council. Williams wanted to appeal his ban and sought legal counsel. His club urged him to not appeal and tried to bribe him with payments, job offers, and extra holidays. While Williams weighed up his options, Dean Richards and club chairman Charles Gillings both resigned from the Harlequins, and William decided to come clean to the tournament organisers. he exposed his club, revealing that fake blood capsules had been used many times before in the past. His ban was reduced to 4 months and he remained with the club. Tunisia wasn't having a great run in the 1960 Summer Olympics in Rome. Their 3-man modern pentathlon team, Vladka Buzid, Habib Ben Azabi, and Ahmed Enachi, was struggling. The event consists of 5 sports: pistol shooting, swimming, equestrian show jumping, cross-country running, and fencing. So competitors need to be a bit of a jack of all trades to do well. During the shooting, one of the Tunisians was disqualified after nearly hitting a judge. In swimming, one of them was floundering so badly he needed to be rescued by a lifeguard, not a common occurrence at the Olympics. Then in the equestrian jumping, all 3 of them were thrown off their horses and scored 0 points. By the final sport, fencing, Tunisia was coming dead last, but they had one last Hail Mary. One of the team members was actually really good at fencing. Since fencers have to wear a helmet that completely covers the face, the team decided to send out the really good guy multiple times, pretending to be his other teammates. He actually fooled the officials for a few bouts and performed well, but they were eventually found out and disqualified. 24 years later, another Olympic imposter would attempt to compete for gold. Madeleine de Jesus was ecstatic to be competing in athletics for Puerto Rico at the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. Long jump was her first event. She came 21st but pulled her hamstring in the process, meaning she would not be able to compete in her next event, the 4x400 meter relay in 6 days. Instead of dropping out and forcing her team to forfeit, she hatched a plan with a little trick up her sleeve. Her identical twin sister Margaret, who had flown to LA as a spectator to support Madeleine. Margaret was a sprinter as well, but missed out on qualifying for the Puerto Rican relay team. So Margaret pretended to be Madeleine and ran with the team in the heats. They ended up in 8th place, qualifying for the finals. However, once their coach, Francisco Colin Alares, found out about the ruse, he pulled the team out of the competition before anyone could figure out what happened. An eagle-eyed Puerto Rican journalist noticed that the young woman who had just raced was missing a mole on her cheek. He put 2 and 2 together and exposed the De Jesus sisters. The Puerto Rican Olympic Committee handed out lifetime bans to both Madeleine and Margaret, as well as the team's coach, even though he denied being in on the ploy. The 3 other relay team members were given 1-year suspensions. Despite this, Madeleine went on to compete in the long jump again at the 1988 Summer Olympics in Mexico City. Horse racing, cornhole, and fishing, some of America's favorite pastimes, and all sports that saw some odd cheating attempts. It was a particularly foggy day on the 11th of January 1990 at Louisiana's Delta Downs horse racing track. The fog was so heavy that part of the track was completely obscured when viewed from a distance. That day, jockey Sylvester Carmouche was due to race 5-year-old Landing Officer in a mile-long race. As the 9 horses in the race lined up at the starting gate, nobody expected Landing Officer to win. He was a 23-1 long shot. The horses took off, then disappeared into the fog. They reappeared a few seconds later as they all ran past the crowd, before fading into the thick mist again. Suddenly, Landing Officer broke through out of nowhere, out in front by 24 lengths. He crossed the finish line first, just 1.2 seconds off the track record. The crowd was stunned, but the other jockeys were livid and immediately challenged Sylvester Carmouche's win. The tape was reviewed, and sure enough, only 8 horses had gone past the stands the first time. "The camera must have missed my horse," Carmouche said. He claimed that Landing Officer had been leading the race way out in front from the start, but obviously nobody saw that happen. The jockey who finished second said he never saw any horse pass him. Landing Officer wasn't breathing heavy at the end of the race, and his legs were clean and not splattered with mud like the other horses. It soon became clear that Carmouche had stopped his horse in the middle of the race and hid in the thick fog, waited for the other horses to go by, then rejoined the race for the last stretch, bursting out of the fog in first place. Sylvester Carmouche was handed a 10-year ban from racing in Louisiana, but it was lifted after 8 years. He was also fined, charged with attempted theft, and was sentenced to 30 days in prison. So it turns out, people will cheat at pretty much anything when there's prize money involved, including fishing. In 1984, 4 Louisiana fishermen admitted to importing live bass from Florida, then pretending to catch them in Texas fishing tournaments and fraudulently won a total of $350,000 in prizes. They all pleaded guilty and received a 5-year prison sentence and fines. In 2012, Englishman Matthew Clark broke into a local aquarium and stole a large bass, then took it to a tournament to pretend that he caught it. He was planning to sneak it back into the aquarium, but accidentally killed it. Clark was sentenced to 100 hours of community service. In 2020, Brent Taylor of Texas was caught using a chopped off fishtail to make his catch look larger. This particular tournament required anglers to submit photos of their bass placed on an approved measuring board. Taylor placed the severed tail further back on his fish and used his hand to strategically cover the overlap. He was busted after officials became suspicious of his photo and searched his boat. In September 2022, the most infamous and shocking cheating scandal in fishing went down. Jake Runyan from Ohio and Chase Cominsky from Pennsylvania were one of the most dominant teams in the world of walleye fishing. They encountered a blip at the end of 2021 when they were disqualified from a tournament after they failed a polygraph test that determined they had cheated, costing them $120,000. But they adamantly denied ever cheating. Runyan was quoted on Cleveland.com, "Our reputation means the world to us, and we would never cheat." Fast forward a few months, and Runyan and Cominsky have won 3 tournaments in a row on the Lake Erie Walleye Trail. Their fellow anglers were suspicious, but nobody could prove that they had cheated. It's the 30th of September. Runyan and Cominsky had just won their final tournament of the year and would pocket $28,000 in prize money. When tournament director Jason Fisher declared that they had the heaviest catch of the day, nobody in the audience seemed excited. There was no applause, just mutters of disbelief. Almost silence as the winners held up their victorious catch for photos. It was clear something was not right. Just by looking at the fish, nobody believed that they were as heavy as the number displayed on the scale. Jason Fisher asked to take another look at the fish. Runyan reluctantly handed his bag of fish over. The atmosphere was tense as Jason Fisher looked for a knife to cut open the fish. Then,
"We got weights and fish!
There we go!
every single one of their fish had been stuffed with weights and fish fillets. Altogether, they had added 7 pounds to the catch. Jake Runyan just stood there with his head hung down in shame, taking the verbal abuse being hurled at him by the other competitors. Chase Cominsky was nowhere to be seen. Police were called, and Runyan and Cominsky were eventually charged with cheating, attempted grand theft, and possessing criminal tools, and a misdemeanor count of illegal animal ownership. They pleaded guilty and were each sentenced to 10 days in prison and ordered to pay a $2,500 fine. They also had to forfeit their $130,000 boat and had their fishing licenses suspended for 3 years. That wasn't it for these two upstanding citizens though. Jake Runyan was later separately charged with domestic violence and unlawful restraint. Chase Cominsky was accused of stalking and harassment of his ex-wife, then faced a new charge of conspiracy after knowingly giving his son counterfeit money to use at a bowling alley. His 18-year-old son was charged with forgery, counterfeiting, conspiracy, and theft by deception. A year later, Cominsky was exposed as a deer poacher after it was discovered that several of his mounted deer heads were harvested out of season and on a suspended hunting license. Somehow, the very public humiliation of Runyan and Cominsky was not enough to deter Peter Smith from cheating in almost the exact same way in the Bart's Cove Walleye Duel in Dunkirk, New York in July 2023. The grand prize was an all-inclusive Panama fishing trip valued at $14,500. Peter Smith wanted it so badly he stuffed his fish with smaller fish to make his catch heavier. He was caught in the act and banned from ever participating in fishing events in New York State for life. Our next story takes place in South Carolina in August 2022 at the American Cornhole League World Championships. Yes, that's a thing. For those unfamiliar, the game is essentially tossing a beanbag into a hole in a wooden board, but it's clearly gained a lot of popularity outside of just backyard barbecues. The American Cornhole League now has over 150,000 members and puts on thousands of events around the US every year. According to the Wall Street Journal, top pro players earn up to $250,000 a year from prize money, sponsors, and endorsements. With stakes this high, it's not surprising players have started manipulating their beanbags to gain an edge over the competition. Bags need to be a certain size and weight, but apparently techniques like boiling the bags in vinegar or washing them with fabric softener have become common and are completely within the rules. However, at the 2022 World Championships, Baggate rocked the cornhole community. It all started during a doubles game, when professional cornholer Devin Harbaugh made a complaint about his opponents Mark Richards and Philip Lopez, the #1 ranked doubles team at the time. Harbaugh believed that the other team's beanbags were smaller than regulation. Officials measured the bags, and sure enough, they were too thin. A thinner bag means it can glide through the air and fall through the hole easier. Lopez and Richards then turned it around and requested that their opponent's bags be checked. Lo and behold, Devin Harbaugh and his teammate Derek King's bags were also too small. An hour later, officials determined that the infractions were honest mistakes and not intentional. The ACL has since cracked down on beanbag compliance and has started to invest more into the sport's infrastructure. Chess has quite a checkered past when it comes to weird cheating attempts, going back all the way to 1770, when German inventor Wolfgang von Kempelen created a mechanical device that could beat any human at a game of chess. It featured a mannequin dressed in Ottoman clothing that would move chess pieces in a very lifelike way. The machine, which eventually became known as the Turk, changed ownership over the decades and toured the world, challenging strong chess players and beating them. It won against notable people like Napoleon Bonaparte and Benjamin Franklin. For 84 years, the Turk dazzled 18th and 19th century audiences until it was destroyed in a fire. The son of one of its owners published an article revealing that the whole thing had been an elaborate hoax. There was a human being inside the machine the whole time, controlling the movements. Several different chess masters over the years secretly sat inside the cabinet, operating a series of levers to control the Turk's arm. Accusations of collusion and match fixing in professional tournaments have been thrown around for decades, while in more casual arenas like public parks, sleight of hand tricks have been used to cheat. 1978's World Chess Championship became infamous for the mind games between the two finalists, Anatoly Karpov and Viktor Korchnoi. Sunglasses with mirrored lenses, a custom chair was x-rayed, there were accusations of hypnosis, a handshake refusal, yogurt that contained a secret code, and in one player's entourage were yoga teachers who were out on bail for attempted murder. This match really had it all, but nobody was strictly cheating. In 1993, an unrated, unknown player who used the alias John von Neumann managed to win 4 games at the World Open. He was wearing headphones and had some sort of device in his pocket that would occasionally buzz. His opponents reported him and he was busted after he failed to answer questions about basic chess rules. To this day, we still don't know who this mysterious fellow was. More recently, mobile phones have become a common way to cheat amongst chess pros. In 2010, 3 French players and their coach were given suspensions for their elaborate scheme. The coach was texting a player who was at home using a computer to determine the best moves. The coach would then sit or stand in specific ways to signal to the players in the competition particular moves. Over the next few years, several others would get caught consulting their mobile phones that were hidden in the bathroom ahead of time. But the scandal that rocked the chess world and made mainstream news headlines was between grandmasters Magnus Carlsen and Hans Niemann. It started on the 4th of September 2022 at the Singfield Cup in Missouri. World champion Magnus Carlsen, who is widely considered to be the greatest chess player of all time, had just been unexpectedly defeated in the 3rd round by the lowest ranked competitor, Hans Niemann. His 53-game unbeaten streak had just ended. Carlsen then dropped out of the tournament, the first time he had ever withdrawn from a major event, and just something rarely ever done at elite level chess. He didn't explain why he dropped out, nor did he outright accuse Niemann of cheating, but he later tweeted out a video that implied something was dodgy. Over the next few days, the chess community scrutinized Niemann's past. Former world number 2 chess player Hikaru Nakamura remarked in a live stream that Carlsen most likely suspected Niemann was cheating. Chess.com published a 72-page report detailing evidence of Niemann's cheating in over 100 online chess games in the past, then deleted his account. Niemann admitted that he had indeed used computer programs to cheat in online chess, but only when he was 12 years old, then again at 16 when there was no prize money at stake, but denied ever cheating in an over-the-board game. His ELO rating, chess skill level rating, had also increased incredibly fast in just a couple of years. Theories about vibrating sex toys hidden up his bum began to spread on social media. Back in July, programmer James Stanley had blogged about creating a vibrating device that could communicate with a chess engine while remaining hidden in his shoe. He had created this device in the name of science, of course, but it added fuel to the theory that Niemann had used a hidden vibrating device to cheat. In response to these theories, Niemann said,
"They want me to strip fully naked? I'll do it. I don't care because I know that I'm clean. And you want me to play in a closed box with zero electric transmission? I don't care, you know."
Despite all this, there was no concrete evidence that he had cheated during that Singfield Cup game against Magnus Carlsen. On the 19th of September 2022, just 2 weeks after their encounter at the Singfield Cup, Carlsen and Niemann were to play in the online tournament Julius Baer Generation Cup, which boasted a prize pool of $140,000. Niemann played the first move of the highly anticipated rematch. Carlsen made his first move, then immediately resigned from the game and disconnected from the whole thing, once again without warning or explanation.
D4, knight f6, c4, yeah, definitely. And what? No.
What happened? What?
No. What happened? That's it?
Magnus Carlsen just resigned, got up and left.
1 week later, Magnus Carlsen posted his official statement on Twitter and straight up accused Hans Niemann of cheating. His over-the-board progress has been unusual, and throughout our game in the Singfield Cup, I had the impression that he wasn't tense or even fully concentrating on the game in critical positions, Carlsen stated. 1 month later, Niemann filed a federal defamation lawsuit against Magnus Carlsen, Carlsen's company Play Magnus Group, Chess.com, and its chief of chess, Danny Wrench, along with chess grandmaster and streamer Hikaru Nakamura. Niemann was seeking $100 million in damages, but a US judge dismissed the lawsuit in June 2023. In August, Chess.com announced that all parties had resolved their issues and agreed to move on, then reinstated Niemann's account.
In 1980, Rosie Ruiz ran the Boston Marathon, the oldest and most prestigious marathon in the world. She was unknown in the running world, and to everyone's surprise, she beat other reigning champions and became the first woman to cross the finish line. As she celebrated on the podium with her gold medal, it quickly became clear that something was not quite right. This is the story of Rosie Ruiz, the marathon cheater. Rosie Ruiz was born in Havana, Cuba in 1953 and immigrated to the United States at age 8 with only her brother. She lived with her aunts, uncles, and cousins in Hollywood, Florida, and remained separated from her parents for most of her childhood. Naturally, it was a major culture shock for young Ruiz, who suddenly felt very isolated in a foreign country where she barely knew the language. To help cope with this adjustment, Ruiz began running. She fell in love with the sport and competed in cross-country running in high school, but that came to a halt when she suffered a knee injury and had to undergo surgery. In her first year of college, Ruiz was involved in a serious car accident that caused major head trauma. She experienced severe headaches and even blackouts that lasted for months after the accident. She went back to the hospital to get her head examined, and doctors discovered a tangerine-sized tumor embedded in her skull. The tumor turned out to be benign, but she still needed surgery to remove it. After college, Ruiz moved to New York City and secured a job as an administrative assistant in Manhattan. She got an apartment right near Times Square and seemed to be enjoying the fast-paced big city life. However, in late 1977, Ruiz had her first run-in with the law. She allegedly stole credit cards from an acquaintance and amassed $1,500 in false charges. The acquaintance reported her to the NYPD, but Ruiz paid all the money back and the charges were dropped. In 1978, Ruiz's health problems returned when doctors discovered a defect in her skull left by the first brain surgery. She had yet another surgery to have a plastic plate inserted in her skull. Ruiz overcame some major hurdles in her early life, and she always turned to running as a way to cope. It was 1979, the year before she would go on to compete in the Boston Marathon, and she was finally healthy enough to start running again. She began running regularly through Central Park and on the treadmill, and after a few months, she decided to enter the New York City Marathon. The marathon is a long-distance foot race of 42.195 kilometers or 26 miles and 385 yards. The name marathon comes from an ancient Greek myth, and the event was introduced at the first modern Olympic Games in Athens in 1896. Today, there are over 800 official marathon races held all around the world, and it remains one of the oldest and most popular sporting spectacles. The first New York City Marathon was held in 1970, so it was still a relatively new event when Ruiz decided she would compete in 1979. Although she was a talented and serious runner, Ruiz was not ready for a full marathon. It typically takes months to prepare, and elite marathon athletes train all year round with coaches. When Ruiz realized she missed the deadline to enter the New York City Marathon, she contacted the organizers and pleaded for a spot, claiming she was dying of brain cancer. The event's organizers were sympathetic and granted her an exemption. It was October 21st, 1979. The 10th annual New York City Marathon was underway. There were over 11,000 runners and 2.5 million spectators lined up along the race route. Ruiz stood at the starting line in a huge crowd of fellow competitors and took off as the starting shot was fired. Ruiz felt good. Her first 8 miles was strong and she was feeling confident. However, at the 10-mile mark, not even halfway, Ruiz began to tire. Determined to finish the race, she decided to take a shortcut. She walked off the course and headed for a nearby New York subway station. She did her best not to draw attention to herself as she boarded a train going north towards Manhattan and the finish line. The marathon was a huge event, and it wasn't unusual to see competitors around the city, so Ruiz figures she probably didn't need to keep that low of a profile after all. In fact, she struck up a conversation with another passenger, Susan Morrow, a photographer who was also headed to the marathon's finish line in Central Park. Ruiz told Morrow she injured her ankle, but still wanted to go cheer on the other runners. As the two made their way to Central Park, Ruiz was clearly limping and leaned on Morrow's shoulder for support. Ruiz pushed through the crowd to the barricades at the finish line and declared herself an injured runner. She was taken to the medical tent where she told staff she had already finished the race, so they gave her a finishing time of 2 hours, 56 minutes and 29 seconds, placing her 11th in the women's ranking. This time also qualified her for the Boston Marathon. The Boston Marathon took place just 6 months after the New York City Marathon. It was the oldest and longest running marathon in the world, established in 1897, 1 year after the first modern Olympic Games. Rosie Ruiz was determined to complete the world-renowned marathon, but knew she had a long way to go if she wanted to run the race legitimately. On top of that, her friends and colleagues celebrated her achievement at the New York City Marathon, and her boss, who was also an avid runner, was especially impressed and even offered to pay for Ruiz's trip to Boston. Ruiz soaked up the attention and admiration, but pressure was also mounting. In the months before the Boston Marathon, Ruiz trained as hard as she could. Her anxiety was growing. Everyone she knew had lofty expectations of her, and she didn't want to disappoint anyone, or worse, expose her lie. Despite her best efforts to train, Ruiz knew deep down it had simply not been enough for her to even get close to her recorded time in the New York City Marathon. The Boston Marathon was also a much more established event, and there would be far more media coverage. It would be much more difficult to cheat this time. On the morning of April 21st, 1980, Rosie Ruiz made her way to the starting line of the 84th annual Boston Marathon. She was 26 years old, and her qualifying time from New York ranked her 50th among the female runners. Her bib was emblazoned with W50. Jacqueline Gouraud was standing just a little ahead of Ruiz in the nervous crowd. Gouraud was a Canadian marathon champion and the favorite to win the women's race. Patty Lyons was an American marathon champion and considered to be Gouraud's main competition. There were a total of 456 women and over 5,000 men competing that year, and Rosie Ruiz was on nobody's radar. The starting gun was fired and they were off. It was only a few miles into the race when Ruiz began to feel exhausted. She had trained hard, but it wasn't enough. There was no possibility of her completing the race. She could drop out of the race now, go home, and potentially have her lie revealed. Or she could cheat the same way she did in New York. So just like in New York, she jogged off the race route and found a spot out of view, where she hid for an hour. She then made her way to the closest train station and rode the train for another hour. This time, she didn't chat with any strangers and kept a low profile on the crowded train. Meanwhile, Jacqueline Garreau had already been acknowledged as the women's lead at the halfway checkpoint, as well as at the 21 and 24 mile checkpoints. Fans at the finish line could see a woman approaching and everyone cheered, expecting to see Garreau, but it was the unknown Rosie Ruiz, who was the first woman to cross the finish line at the 1980 Boston Marathon. The crowd roared as Ruiz flailed her limbs, falling onto police officers for support, seemingly unable to walk on her own anymore. Cameras surrounded her as a laurel wreath was placed on her head and a gold medal around her neck. Ruiz was all smiles and happy tears, but a sense of confusion and skepticism had already descended upon the finishing area of the Boston Marathon. Ruiz crossed the finish line with a time of 2 hours, 31 minutes, and 56 seconds. This would have been the third fastest marathon time ever run by a woman. This would have also been a 25-minute improvement on her New York marathon time, which was just months ago. When Jacqueline Garreau crossed the finish line, she was extremely confused. She was expecting huge cheers for her, but to her shock, another woman she didn't recognize had already been given the gold medal. Garreau graciously accepted second place, but as she heard more details about Ruiz, she became very concerned. Bill Rogers, the men's winner, also realized something was not quite right. Like many other running fans, he expected Garreau to be standing beside him on the winner's podium. Bill Rogers was a veteran marathon runner and a 4-time Boston champion. He took one look at Rosie Ruiz and knew a terrible mistake had been made. She was wearing a t-shirt with longer sleeves when most elite runners prefer thin sleeveless tank tops. She didn't appear to be that sweaty or tired, and she also did not have the physique of a world-class marathoner. Rogers asked Ruiz about her splits, which are the times it took her to run each section of the race, something all runners at that level would keep track of. Ruiz had no idea what splits even were. When Jacqueline Garreau was asked about Ruiz's improvement from 2:56 to 2:31, she raised her eyebrows doubtfully and replied, "She must have very good training." Bill Rogers said,
"I think it would be very tough to go from 2:56 to 2:31.
The biggest red flag was, of course, the fact that none of the other women in the first group saw Ruiz at any point in the race, and Jacqueline Garreau and Patty Lyons both never saw another woman overtake them. Things were not adding up, and before long, the media caught wind of the confusion. Catherine Switzer unofficially ran the Boston Marathon in 1967, making her the second woman to ever finish the race. Switzer asked Ruiz in a TV interview,
"Have you been doing a lot of heavy intervals?"
Someone else asked me that. I'm not sure what intervals are. What are they?
Well, intervals are track workouts that are designed to make your speed improve dramatically. And if you went from a 2:56 to a 2:31, one would normally expect that you do a lot of speed work. Is someone coaching you or advising you?
No, I advise myself.
Switzer called Ruiz.
The mystery woman winner, we missed her at all our checkpoints. She came through the finish in a fantastic 2:31. We have to confirm that time at this point, but she was way ahead of a world-class field here today in the Boston Marathon. Thank you, Rosie.
Thank you.
The next day, Ruiz and Rogers, the two winners of the Boston Marathon, were due to appear together on national morning television. Backstage, Rogers told Ruiz this was her chance to come clean if an error was made. Ruiz started crying. Rogers, expecting a confession, was taken aback when Ruiz exclaimed, "I won, I won." Whispers of skepticism within the marathon world quickly snowballed into a scandal picked up by mainstream media. Bill Rogers went to the Boston Marathon race director, Will Cloney, and shared his suspicions. Cloney knew he had to handle the matter delicately. He did not want to harm the reputation of the marathon. Cloney personally spoke with Ruiz soon after the race, where she again maintained that she had won fair and square. The only person who helped back up her claims was her friend and president of a local running club, Steve Merrick, who said he witnessed her run the start of the marathon. Merrick himself had been accused of cheating during the New York Marathon by riding in a car for part of the race. Will Cloney was conflicted and was reluctant to make a ruling without solid evidence. He and the Boston Athletic Association launched a thorough investigation into Ruiz. First, checkpoint data was examined. At the time, the checkpoints only recorded the first 100 runners who passed through. Because the first 100 runners were all men, there was no data on any women who passed through. The investigation then turned to all the video footage that was captured. as well as over 10,000 photographs taken throughout the race. A team of experts, including Catherine Switzer, pored over all the material and were unable to spot Ruiz even once. The New York Marathon also opened its own investigation into Ruiz to determine whether her performance there was legitimate. Meanwhile, the media scrutiny was intensifying as reporters hounded Ruiz outside her New York apartment, and she was eventually driven out of her home. She wanted this all to pass and to let the news cycle forget about her, and hopefully get to hang on to her gold medal. The Boston Marathon investigation interviewed runners who finished around the same time as Ruiz, and none of them saw her during the race. The New York Marathon examined video of every runner who crossed the finish line and never saw Ruiz. However, Will Cloney still didn't believe there was enough solid evidence to disqualify Ruiz. In 1980, John Faulkner was a Harvard senior when he and a classmate decided to jog over the Harvard Bridge to watch the final mile of the Boston Marathon. Faulkner saw Bill Rogers and other men's leaders, then looked to his right as more runners approached from Kenmore Square.
I just saw someone stumble out of the crowd in front of me across the street. This was on Commonwealth Ave, probably about a half mile from the finish. She was in track clothes and wearing a number, but I thought someone had just sort of stumbled into the race. Maybe somebody was a little crazy or something.
Faulkner jogged home shortly afterwards, delighted to have caught a glimpse of the marathon winners. The next morning, Faulkner checked the newspaper and his stomach dropped. He had heard mentions of some controversy over the women's marathon winner, but when he saw Rosie Ruiz's photograph, the woman in the yellow t-shirt, he knew he had to blow the whistle. That same day, Susan Morrow, the photographer who chatted with Ruiz on the New York subway, also realized she needed to let someone know about their interaction. She spoke with a New York Times sports writer, and the writer took Morrow to Rosie Ruiz's press conference to make sure this was the same person. It was indeed the same person Morrow had spoken to and traveled with at the New York Marathon. At her press conference, Ruiz faced a sea of reporters and continued to insist that she had done nothing wrong. She said that her fellow competitors didn't remember or recognize her because she was new to the sport. She said that investigators reviewing the videotapes mistook her for a man because of her short haircut. She said the whole controversy was made up because the organizers wanted one of the favorites to win, not an unknown runner like herself. She also argued the overwhelming media coverage was a positive thing and would encourage more women to compete in marathons. Ruiz was highly emotional at the press conference, lamenting the fact that she only had a moment to enjoy her win before being unfairly treated by the media and the public. Fred Lebo, the New York City Marathon organizer, was already convinced that Ruiz had cheated in both New York and Boston. He wanted to invalidate Ruiz's New York finish time that had qualified her for Boston. This decision would retroactively make Ruiz ineligible for Boston, thus automatically disqualifying her. But Will Cloney, the Boston race director who had a background in law, was still very hesitant and delayed the announcement. Even with 2 solid eyewitness statements and mounting circumstantial evidence, Cloney wanted to double-check every last bit of information before officially disqualifying Ruiz. On the 26th of April, 1980, 8 days after Rosie Ruiz crossed the finish line in Boston, Fred Lebo announced that she was disqualified from the New York City Marathon. Her Boston Marathon title was effectively stripped from her. She maintained her innocence and refused to return her gold medal. Will Cloney let her keep it and even encouraged her to run the Boston Marathon the next year. She never did. After the Boston Marathon cheating scandal, Rosie Ruiz's life went on a downward spiral. She had become infamous all around the world. Her boss, who had paid for her trip to Boston, fired Ruiz upon her return to New York. A year after the debacle, just a few days before the 1981 Boston Marathon, Ruiz sat for a media interview in her lawyer's office and once again insisted that she had been telling the truth the year before. Despite this, she declined many offers, including some that would have paid her thousands of dollars to compete in races and prove she was capable of running an entire marathon. In 1982, Ruiz found a job as a bookkeeper at a New York City real estate agency. She handled all the money that passed through the agency and began skimming money and forging checks. Co-workers wondered how she was able to afford weekend ski trips and daily taxis to work. In a strange twist of fate, Ruiz was arrested on the day of the 1982 Boston Marathon for embezzling $60,000. She spent 1 week in jail and was sentenced to 5 years probation. Ruiz then moved back to South Florida and obtained her real estate license. But she couldn't resist the opportunity to make a quick buck. She recruited 2 other women and formed a cocaine dealing ring. In 1983, Ruiz's 2 co-conspirators met up with a potential buyer for a $52,000 deal. They negotiated and finalized the deal before the buyer revealed himself to be a narcotics detective. The 2 women were arrested, and a week later, Ruiz turned herself in. She was sentenced to 3 years probation. In 1984, Ruiz married Colombian-born Icaro Vivas. They had 3 sons together before divorcing 2.5 years later. She kept the surname, however, to help maintain her anonymity. Whenever co-workers asked if she was the same Rosie who cheated in the Boston Marathon, she would say no and laugh it off. That same year, Ruiz found out that Jacqueline Garreau was in Miami to run a 10-kilometer race. Ruiz had spent years claiming she had beaten Garreau in Boston, yet the 2 had never properly met. So Ruiz made her way to the race, found Garreau and introduced herself. Garreau immediately asked, "Why did you do that in Boston?" Ruiz replied, "I ran it and I'll run it again." Garreau shook her head and walked away. In 1988, Ruiz met Margarita Alvarez at a mutual friend's party. The 2 women became best friends and then began a romantic relationship that would last until Ruiz's death on July 8, 2019. She had been fighting cancer for over 10 years and passed away peacefully at age 66. Rosie Ruiz's cheating scandal didn't tarnish the legacy of the Boston Marathon, as Will Clonley had feared, and it is still one of the most popular marathons in the world. But since 1980, the road racing world has seen many upgrades to ensure another Rosie Ruiz can never happen. Television cameras now follow the leading runners from start to finish. Every competitor is now given digital tracking chips to attach to their shoes so they can be monitored at all times. In a 1998 interview, Ruiz revealed that she was still in possession of her gold medal. She also said she watched the Boston Marathon every year, calling herself a masochist, and asserted once again that she had won the race. However, Steve Merrick, Ruiz's friend and only ally during the media frenzy, later told the Boston Globe newspaper that Ruiz had confessed the truth to him. She jumped out of the crowd, not knowing that the first woman hadn't gone by yet, Merrick said. She was as shocked as anyone when she came in first. But at that point, they had put the crown on her, gave her the medal, and told her she's the winner. How could she say, "No, I'm not"? Bill Rogers, the men's winner, similarly said she had no idea she was going to win. She was overwhelmed. It wasn't someone who planned to win. Perhaps if Rosie Ruiz had just been a little more patient and waited for a few women to cross the finish line before she jumped back into the race, she could have gotten away with it.